cemetery department a few years back. It was a pretty straightforward gig, mostly mowing grass, fixing fences, and general upkeep at the local cemeteries. Occasionally, we'd get calls from people who stumbled upon old headstones in random places. Farmers, hikers, you name it. Our job was to go out there, poke around with dowel rods to see if there were more headstones, and reestablish the cemetery. I'd been on a few of these discovery jobs, but one in particular still creeps me out to this day. And it started when we got a tip from a farmer who had been clearing a path through a stand of trees at the edge of his property. He was just trying to get easier access to his field, but stumbled upon a couple of headstones in the process. The farmer called it in, figuring it was something we'd want to look into. I went out there with two of my coworkers to check it out. When we arrived, we immediately saw the stones. They were old, worn down to the point that some of the writing was barely legible. And after a few hours of probing the ground, we uncovered several more headstones, at least a dozen. As we started to clean them up and record the names, we realized this wasn't just any old cemetery. It was the oldest one in the county, dating back to the 1700s. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but there was one that stood out. 2 headstones side by side, marking the graves of a husband and a wife who had been school teachers. Naturally, we did some digging into the history of the place. What we found was unsettling. Before the cemetery had been established, there was a small schoolhouse on the land. The teachers, that same husband and wife from the headstones, ran the school. The story goes that something happened there. No one knows exactly what, but the entire school, students and teachers included, ended up dead. From what we could gather, it sounded like some kind of illness swept through the school, and they were quarantined inside to prevent it from spreading. The details were sketchy, but the implication was that no one made it out. After they died, the schoolhouse was demolished, and the bodies were buried right where it once stood. They did not even move them, just buried everyone right there. There was something about that discovery that did not sit right with me. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, tucked away in the trees where it had been forgotten for over a century. Maybe it was the vague, eerie nature of the story itself. Either way, it got under my skin. A couple of weeks after we restored the cemetery, I had a vivid dream about it. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by the old headstones. The sky was overcast, and there was this heavy feeling in the air, like a storm was coming. I remember hearing children's voices, faint at first, like they were whispering. Then I heard the creak of a door, like the old schoolhouse had suddenly come back to life. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the wind through the trees. I woke up drenched in sweat and couldn't shake the feeling that something from that place had followed me home. I don't believe in ghosts or anything, but I stopped volunteering for those discovery jobs after that. You know how people say some places feel haunted? Yeah, that cemetery, I'm sure of it. Now, I used to work in a large state hospital that was pretty much a city in itself. There were several buildings spread across the campus, and I was mainly stationed in the geriatrics unit. We also had an acute care building, which was connected by a network of underground tunnels. The basement of that building housed the morgue, which of course had all the eerie vibes you would expect. I never liked going down there, but it was part of the job. One day we had an older patient pass away in the geriatrics wing. The woman had been there for a while, struggling with arthritis and dementia. Nothing unusual about her passing. She lived a long, tough life. I was told to get the body ready for transport to the morgue, which was standard procedure. Now, we didn't have a traditional ambulance for transporting deceased patients. Instead, we used this old station wagon that had been converted to carry a stretcher in the back. It wasn't marked as an emergency vehicle, and it definitely had seen better days, but it worked for what we needed. I grabbed a new girl, one of the newer hires, to help me with the transport. We loaded the body onto the stretcher and slid it into the back of the station wagon. The patient was wrapped in a shroud, as usual, and everything was going as expected. The newbie seemed a little nervous, but I figured it was just because it was one of her first times dealing with a deceased patient. Everyone's nervous at their first. We started driving to the morgue, which was about a 10-minute drive through the campus. As we were going, I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit, just to make sure everything was secure. That's when I saw it. The body had started to sit up. Now, I knew this wasn't some supernatural event. I've been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes, after death, the body can stiffen and muscles can contract, which causes the body to move. It's rare, but it happens, especially with elderly patients who had arthritis, like this one did. But still, it looked unsettling as hell. I kept my cool and said to the new girl, "Don't look back. Whatever you do, don't look." Of course, telling someone not to do something is pretty much a guarantee that they're going to do it. She turned around, took one look at the body half sitting up, and lost it. She let out this blood-curdling scream, threw open the passenger door while we were still moving, and jumped out of the car before I could stop her. I slammed on the brakes and watched her take off down the street, running like her life depended on it. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there in the front seat with a corpse in the back that looks like it's trying to rise from the dead. I took a deep breath, got out of the car, and pushed the body back down onto the stretcher, making sure it was secured. I drove the rest of the way to the morgue, alone, got the body unloaded, and did my best to put the whole experience behind me. Once everything was handled, I went to find the newbie. I found her sitting on the steps of a house downtown, talking to herself. She was mumbling stuff like, "I ain't working with no spooks no more." She never came back to work after that. Can't say I blame her. But if you ask me, the scariest part of that day wasn't the body sitting up. It was how fast she managed to jump out of a moving car and sprint like she was being chased by demons. My girlfriend and I used to do this weird thing that most people would probably find odd. We'd sneak out to our local cemetery at night. I know it sounds creepy, but for us, it wasn't. We loved the peace and quiet. There's something calming about being surrounded by nothing but gravestones and old trees swaying in the breeze, especially when it's late at night. One night, we decided to head out there like we usually did, but it was around 1 a.m., the kind of hour where the world feels completely still. We wandered through the rows of headstones, hand in hand, until we found our usual spot, a large, old oak tree tucked away toward the back of the cemetery. It was far enough from the entrance that we wouldn't be disturbed, not that anyone ever came around at that time. We sat down beneath the tree, talking for a while before things got a little heated. We were making out, completely lost in each other, when we heard something. I pulled away and listened carefully. There it was again, a soft, scraping sound coming from a few rows over. I motioned for my girlfriend to stay quiet, and we both turned to look. A few rows down, we could just make out a figure, a man, digging into the ground. He had a shovel and was working at a patch of dirt like he had somewhere to be. I checked my phone. 1:07 a.m. This wasn't normal. My heart rate picked up, and I could feel my girlfriend tense beside me. We weren't supposed to be here. but neither was this guy. Who digs a grave at this hour? We crouched down, hoping he wouldn't notice us, but the man must have sensed something. He stopped digging, stood up, and looked right in our direction. For a second, none of us moved. He just stared at us, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to walk over. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, and I told my girlfriend to stay put and started toward him, doing the best to seem calm. As I got closer, I saw his face more clearly. He looked nervous, sweaty even though it was a cool night, and I asked him what he was doing, trying not to sound accusatory. "I'm the gravekeeper," he said, his voice shaky. "Got a burial tomorrow, and I'm just getting things ready." I don't know much about cemeteries or when they dig graves, so I just nodded. I wasn't convinced, but I did not have any reason to push further. He kept fidgeting, like he wanted me to leave, and that was enough for me to want to get out of there. The mood was completely gone at that point, so I went back to my girlfriend and told her we should head home. We walked out of the cemetery, constantly checking over our shoulders. I couldn't shake this weird feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, we saw something on Facebook that made my stomach drop. A body had been buried in the cemetery the night before, and it was a teenage boy, someone who'd been involved in gang activity. He'd been killed the day before and buried there, and I couldn't help but wonder if the man we saw was somehow connected. Was he really a gravekeeper, or was he involved in something much darker? We even went to the police, told them everything we'd seen, but as far as I know, no one was ever caught for the murder. I still think about it sometimes. That man, digging in the middle of the night, was he just doing his job, or were we witnessing something that we shouldn't have? When I was in high school, growing up in a small Midwestern town, there wasn't much to do, especially at night. Most weekends, my friends and I would drive around aimlessly, listening to music, hoping to pass the time until curfew. Our town was the definition of quiet. Nothing much happened, and when something did, it became the talk of the town for months. One event struck us more than anything: the self-deletion of a classmate named Tommy. Tommy had always been a bit of an outsider, someone who never quite fit in, but nobody ever expected he would take his own life. He did it in the most tragic way imaginable, hanging himself from a tree that stood directly over his mother's grave. His mother had died a couple of years before, and he had never really been the same after that. We did not talk much about him after the funeral, but the town felt different after that. Fast forward a few months, and my friends and I found ourselves on a road near the cemetery late one Saturday night. The cemetery itself was old, overgrown in parts, and barely maintained. Just the kind of place where we would dare each other to go at night. But none of us really wanted to, especially after what happened with Tommy. We were driving, 3 of us crammed into my beat-up car, passing that same road where the cemetery entrance was. And it was one of those dark, moonless nights where the only light came from the car's headlights. As we got closer to the cemetery, we noticed the car pulled over on the side of the road. It was just sitting there, no hazards on, no one outside, and I slowed down, squinting to see who it might be. The car was old, maybe from the late 80s, and it looked like it hadn't moved in a while. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat, head down like they were sleeping, and it was weird. Who would park out here this late at night? My friend in the passenger seat nudged me to slow down even more, curiosity taking over. As we crawled past the car, the figure in the driver's seat stirred. They turned their head towards us, and I swear to God, I couldn't breathe. It was Tommy. His face was pale, almost gray, his eyes hollowed out like he hadn't slept in years. For a split second, I thought maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him. But as we got closer, there was no mistaking it. It was him. All three of us screamed at the same time, and I floored the gas. We sped down the road, hearts racing, not saying a word. It felt like we didn't breathe until we were miles away. But something made me stop. Maybe it was shock, or maybe part of me didn't believe what we'd just seen. I turned the car around, convincing myself it couldn't have been Tommy. He was gone, buried right there in that cemetery. There was no way. We drove back, this time even slower, scanning the road. But the car was gone. The side of the road was empty, as if nothing had been there in the first place. We were too freaked out to stop and check, so I hit the gas again and did not slow down until we made it back into town. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. None of us ever talked about it again. Not really. But every time I drive past that cemetery, I still get a chill, and I always keep my eyes on the road, just in case. This was honestly the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. Cemeteries have always felt like a strange comfort to me, which sounds odd, but after surviving a couple of self-deletion attempts, I found solace in places most people avoid. They've become a reminder that life has its end, and for whatever reason, my time hasn't come yet. So I guess you could say I'm pretty comfortable in cemeteries. They're quiet, peaceful even, not creepy like people make them out to be. And I'm not scared of them, or at least I wasn't until a few months ago. Around Easter, my partner and I went on a road trip. We were heading to this small city, Dubo, for a little break from everything. On the drive, we noticed we were staying only a block away from a cemetery, and that sort of caught my interest. It was a huge one, sprawling across the hill. When we finally got to the Airbnb, my partner crashed for a nap, and I thought, why not take a walk and check out the cemetery? I wandered over, and like I always do, I started reading the headstones. Most people might think it's weird, but I like saying hello to the names I see. It feels respectful. Anyway, this place was massive. Rows and rows of old, worn-out graves with ghost gums and weeping willows casting shadows everywhere. It was beautiful, in that quiet, lonely way cemeteries tend to be. I must have been walking for a good 20 minutes when something caught my eye. There was this one marble angel up ahead, maybe 50 meters away. It was one of those statues that looked like it had been there for decades, weathered and slightly stained from the rain. I felt this strange pull towards it, like I had to go see it. It wasn't a choice. It was like I was being drawn to it. When I got closer, I felt a chill, even though it wasn't cold. The air felt different. I approached the grave and bent down to read the name on the headstone. That's when my heart almost stopped. Erica Fronlin, my full name. I stared at it for what felt like forever. I did not know how to react. It was like looking into a mirror, but not a physical one. Something deeper, more unsettling. I remember feeling blood drained from my face. I'm not the kind of person who believes in fate or ghosts or any of that, but seeing my name carved into the stone felt wrong, like it was some kind of message I wasn't ready to hear. She had died in 1976, long before I was even born, but still it shook me. I snapped a photo of the headstone with my phone at the time, but it was my old phone, and now I can't seem to find it. I've searched for it more times than I'd like to admit, but maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I wonder if I even want to look at that again. And I told my partner about it later that night, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was a weird coincidence. Maybe it was. But even now, writing this, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. What are the chances that I would find my own name on a headstone in a cemetery I randomly decided to visit? I guess whoever she was, her time came. I just hope when mine does, it's less unsettling.
Hey, what's up guys? It's Spooky. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you survived. If you did not know, I have an Instagram. Follow me on there so we can connect. I also have a Patreon. On there you'll have direct access to me and can see the upcoming videos, polls, and soon-to-be exclusive stories only shared on there. If that's something that interests you, please consider joining. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Stay spooky and I'll see you in the next video.